Hey everyone, this is Ross, and today we're going to be talking about the final preparations to make before you set up your aquarium. So let's say, for example, you've got all the materials you need, all the equipment that you need to set up your aquarium. You could just go ahead and put it all together and just hope for the best, but you may end up with some cloudy water and algae blooms. So it's important to think about these few quick tips and tricks before you set up your fish tank. So today we're going to be discussing, first of all, the location for the fish tank. Have you thought about where you want to put it, and what other considerations have you got to make, because it's not quite as easy as that. Going to talk about the aquarium itself, anything that we need to do to that to make it safe for the fish. We're going to talk about the substrate and the fact that some substrate has a lot of dust in it and it needs washed before you can actually use it to prevent the water from going cloudy. So we're going to talk about how to stop the cloudy water. We're going to discuss the live plants themselves, things that they can actually bring in the aquarium that are bad, and also just how to prepare them, split them up, ready to go in the fish tank. We're going to talk about aquarium wood, tips and tricks for that, if it floats, how to stop it from floating, and what to do about the brown colour in your tank that sometimes leaches from the wood. And finally, we're going to discuss things that can help you plant the aquarium, such as spray bottles. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually where you want to put your fish tank. So have a think about around your house if you've got any spare areas where you can actually fit one. In this room, it's quite messy already down there, as you can see. My bed takes up a good portion of it, and that's just like where my computer stays. So I've only really got this little table, or what's it called, shelving unit, where I can put the fish tank. So I can only really afford in this room to have a small fish tank. So one of the first things you got to think about is lighting. So you don't want it in direct bright sunlight all day. So the window's over there, so if the tank was just there, I might have to think about putting it somewhere else, because if you have the fish tank in full sunlight all day, you can get some pretty bad algae problems. So you want it somewhere a bit shady where you can easily control your own lighting yourself. The next thing is actually thinking about the shelving unit, or the table it's on itself, can actually support the weight of the fish tank. And a good rule of thumb for fish tanks is, this is a 24 litre fish tank, and roughly 1 litre of water weighs 1 kilogram. So this is going to weigh about 24 kilograms, plus I'm putting rocks in, which may be heavier than the water itself. So probably maximum weight is going to be 30 kilograms with all the stuff in and all the electrics hanging off the back of it. So have a look at what you're going to put on. Can it support that amount of weight? This is down to you, everyone's going to be different. I was considering putting metal supports under this, so if your table can't support a fish tank, you can maybe think about getting some metal shelving supports, some little elbow pieces, just screwing them in underneath. I've done this in the past. So in my old room I put 2 supports either side, and I had wooden cross beams going across, all screwed into the bottom so you couldn't see anything from the top. That just made it a lot stronger, but this should be okay. I'm going to take the risk. Next thing you need to consider is footfall and traffic. So this isn't an ideal position really for a fish tank, because it is right next to the door. But if you had a lot of people coming and going, the fish could get quite stressed out with doors banging and whatnot. But it's okay, because I'm the only person who lives in this room. If it's like a corridor, the fish could get quite stressed out with everyone coming and going. Other things you got to think about is the viewing angle of the fish tank. So this is where I spend most of my time in this room, and certainly over lockdown I'm just going to be chilling on my computer, playing games, reading books, basically doing what I'm doing. So can you actually see it, the fish tank, from where you spend most of the time in your room? So here is perfect, just direct line of sight from my chair. Just another thing to think about when you're deciding where to put your fish tank is electricity and availability of sockets. So here there's no sockets anywhere around this area. The nearest sockets are either over here, which are all being used for the computer at the minute, or over there, which I just use to charge my phone at night. So you need at least 2 or 3 sockets, one for the light, filter and heater for the fish tank. So I've thought about that as well. So I've just got a little extension lead. This is a 3 meter extension lead, and it's got a few sockets, got 4 sockets coming from it. Just the only thing with this is, make sure it's plugged directly into the wall socket and not into another extension lead. Otherwise you could overload the extension lead. So the plan is to run it from over here, from the wall, I'm going to run it underneath my rug. I'm lucky I've got a rug, so I can just lift it up, run it underneath, and have it come out there. So that's only a metre and a bit, so it's not too far. Hopefully this rug does flatten it out so you don't really notice the wires running underneath. Okay, so the next step is to actually get the fish tank. And something a lot of people forget about is there's probably some oils and silicone grease on this left over from the factory. So just take a damp cloth or a damp paper towel with and just wipe it down. Only takes you 2 minutes, but you don't want those oils and things getting in the fish tank. It could be bad for the fish, and you just want to prevent anything bad from getting in your fish tank from the outset. So you can actually see some of the dirt that I've managed to get out of the fish tank, so it's definitely not 100% clean when you get it from the store. And you don't know how long it's been sat around in warehouses or on the shelves and who's been touching it and what have you, so it's definitely worth cleaning it just for a minute of your time. While you're here as well, it's worth looking at your seals, at the silicone seals. Because this is a cheap fish tank, it's probably made very quickly and just kind of thrown together. So just have a good look at your seals, make sure none of them are damaged, and make sure the sealing goes all the way to the top, which in this case I think it does. If you do want to make sure that you're not going to have any leaks, fill it with water, stick it on some paper towels and leave it for an hour or so, and if you come back and if any of those are wet, it looks like you've got a leak, but this looks fine to me. Okay, so now the tank's clean, I've put it in its final position where I want to have it, and I've just got it slightly off centre to the right so I can still put my car keys and all my essentials down here. So that's where the tank's going to be. Should be okay how it's a little bit off centre. I've got the extension lead fitted, just running under the carpet, bends around here and comes out the back here. So we've got 4 on this one. Important thing to note with electrics and water is they don't mix. So just make sure that you're being safe with it. You have it plugged into a facility that can trip it if there is a problem. And drip loops, always have drip loops. So when you come to fit your filter and your heater to the aquarium, have a big loop and on the wire so that the water can't make it directly to the plug. So I'm going to probably raise that up in a minute so that the water can't drip into the plugs. So safety first on that. Okay, so now I'm going to be preparing the hardscape, so like the rocks and the wood. And the only things I really need to do with these rocks, because they're bought from the shop, is just to give them a rinse under the tap. They sometimes have a little bit of mud or dirt on them, so I'm just going to give them a quick rinse over. If you get rocks from outside, just scrub them really well. Make sure they haven't got any iron in them. So if they're slightly brown, it might be an indication of they've got iron or copper in them. Don't use rocks like that, so no metallic rocks. So now I'm going to discuss wood in the aquarium and some of the problems you could face with it. First thing is nasties and insects coming in on the wood. So if you're using wood from outside, use dead wood and boil it for some time before you put it in the fish tank. But this is shop bought, so it shouldn't have any nasties on it. It's also treated as well, so it should be ready just to go in the fish tank. But the problem you have with this is it floats. So the way to get around this is you can either tie it to a rock and then over time it'll absorb enough water and it should sink, or you can just soak it in the fish tank overnight. So I'm actually setting up the tank tomorrow, so I'm going to stick it in this tank full of water. This isn't the fish tank I'm setting up, by the way, this is just a spare smaller one I've got. So I'm going to put this wood in overnight and hopefully it'll absorb some water, become less buoyant. I don't suspect it'll sink overnight, so tomorrow morning I might have to tie it to some rocks. Sometimes it's just buoyant enough to wedge in the substrate, and the substrate is sometimes enough just to keep it down. So we'll have to see what we're going to do about that tomorrow. But yeah, definitely try and soak your wood at least a week or 2 before setting up your fish tank to avoid this problem. So I've just fully submerged all 3 bits of wood in this spare fish tank here, and just to keep them underwater overnight I've put 2 bits of dragonstone. So this is good as well because any of the impurities that are on the dragonstone should leach out into the water overnight. My hope is that some of the air that's inside the wood, you can see it just bubbling up there, and I'm hoping that it gets a bit less buoyant overnight, but I think it won't remain underwater in the morning. So the guidance on the back of this fluval stratum says to rinse it in tap water before you put it in the fish tank, but don't mix it, because if you mix it, it basically turns into a mud slurry. So it says just put it in a colander or a sieve. I'm going to use a sieve because it's a bit finer, and just lightly run flowing water over it just to remove the majority of any dust. It says when you do put it in a fish tank, put down a plate or some cling film just to prevent the water breaking on the surface of it. But it says it is natural for the water to be cloudy for up to 24 hours after adding this. It's not unsafe for the fish or the shrimp or anything, but it's not an issue because I'm not adding fish until a few days afterwards anyways. So yeah, I'm just going to give this a little rinse now. If people are using gravel, then yes, you can rinse that as much as you want, or you can put it in the fish tank, fill the tank up, drain it, fill up, drain it as many times as you need to make the water a bit clearer. But hopefully the filter should pull out most of the dust with this. Okay, so it's the next morning now, and I've had these 3 bits of wood soaking in this tank of tap water overnight, just to get the last bits of air out of them, to try and make them sink. And surprise, surprise, I've come back in the morning and they're still floating. What I should have done a couple of weeks ago, since I knew I was setting up the tank, was started soaking them early, and maybe they'd be a bit more neutrally buoyant, but they're still quite buoyant. So got 2 options. I could just not use them in the aquascape today, soak them for however long in a separate container, and then add them at a later date, or I could add them to the aquascape today, but I'd have to tie them to a rock to keep them down. So that's what I'm going to do. I've got 3 good sized rocks here to tie them to. What I want to do is just use 1 rock. I think this one will be a little bit too light, so we're limited to these 2. And I'll probably go for this one because it's bigger, it's easier to tie to, and there's more crevices and whatnot to hook the wood onto. So I'm going to tie them onto that rock today. And for this, I've just got some sewing thread, just natural colours. I've tried to get as natural as I can, so I've got a browny bronzy colour here which should hopefully match the wood, and I've also got a dark green colour here that should mask any moss or any plants I'm going to be tying to the wood. So yeah, basically I'm just going to find a layout that I like. I'm going to try and arrange the bits of wood how I would like them to look in the tank, and then try and tie them all to a stone. So I'm basically starting the aquascape early here. So you really need to think about that if you're tying them to rocks, is how you want it to look when you finish. You can just tie it any way you want and put it in the tank, but I like to play around with it first and find a layout that I really like. Okay, so that's the completed feature now. I've tied the bits of wood in a way that I quite like the look of. So I've gone for the kind of mangrove tangled root effect, with a kind of big stump over here, getting lesser and lesser the more right you go. So it's all tied to the rock. The thread does look very messy indeed. I forgot to mention you can choose to silicone the wood to the rock, and I've actually got some aquarium safe silicone too, but I'm happy with this for the time being. I can always go in and change it at a later date, but just for the sake of getting it set up, I'm going to stick with this. Now, it does look messy, and to disguise this, I'm going to be burying the rock in the substrate anyways, so the substrate's probably going to come up to about this level, and all this is going to be buried underneath. So I'm going to have all of the substrate embanked up, and I can wedge plants in the substrate in between each of these roots. And to cover this bit, I've just got Java fern and Java moss that I can tie onto the wood and wedge in the cracks. So hopefully try and disguise some of the thread there. But I think it looks okay. Final check, let's actually make sure it fits in the tank. Might be a little bit tight, but I can always snap off or cut off some of these end pieces. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is divide all the plants up and give them a good clean. So I'm going to start off with the Java fern here, and I'm basically going to split this up into a few different plants per pot. So I've got 2 pots of the narrow leaf variety, and then I'm going to, once I've split up all the plants, I'm then going to tie the Java fern and the Java moss to the wood. and then I'm going to have all the other plants sat here ready for planting in the aquarium. Just a couple of things I've got on hand just to make life a bit easier is I've got a tub of water just to rinse off any of the dirt off the roots, and you get what's called stone wool around the roots, so you need to wash that off. I've just got a container just to put any waste in, so any dead leaves and whatnot. I've got a couple spray bottles, so when I'm laying out all the plants here, as I'm working my way through and dividing the plants, they're going to be sat here for quite a while, and because they're aquatic plants, they have a tendency of drying out when they're just left in the open air. So I've got a couple spray bottles just to keep the plants moist until I can actually plant them. So let's start off opening up the narrow leaf Java fern. There's the plant, looks quite healthy actually. Nice green leaves, and I can't really see any leaves I want to take off, so the first thing I do is look for leaves which are kind of past the best, and I'll usually trim the plant right back. I might take some of the longer leaves off just to encourage new growth, but that looks like a healthy plant to me. So you just squeeze the pot up like that, and that pops out the stone wool. And the stone wool is pretty good because it splits into two halves. It's already kind of split for you, so you just gently tease that apart, give it a little shake, and because Java fern's roots don't grow too deep into the stone wool, it's not too hard to get off, so just tease it off. And you'll find you might just pull off the odd leaf, but as long as it's got what's called a rhizome on it, which is that top root structure, and a few roots of its own, that'll actually turn into a new plant on its own. So I'm going to keep that, and I'm just going to repeat the same process for the rest of the bunch, just teasing off a stone wool. No plants come off with that stone wool, so I can ditch that. And yeah, just continue with the same process. Okay, so now I've pulled off most of the stone wool. You can just see a few remnants of it on the bottom there. And this is actually all one plant, this is one root structure. So I'm just going to dunk the full plant in the water, give it a good rinse about, and try and get off as much stone wool as I can, just so it's not going to be floating around the aquarium when I finally put it in. So there's the roots as clean as I can get them. And now I'm just going to start to tease the plant apart, and it'll naturally want to come apart. I want to try and avoid just getting one leaf like this. I want to get a few leaves if I can. So I'm just teasing the roots apart. But you want to do this because it's been very tight in that pot for quite a while for the amount of time it's been growing. So spreading out your plants, they'll just grow more vigorously and you'll get more of them in the long run. So it's definitely worth doing. You can just stick it straight in one big clump like this, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's a good little clump, that's the size I'm going for, and hopefully over the years that should spread all down the wood and create a nice feature in the middle of the tank. Next I'm going to be splitting up the Sagittaria subulata. I've got 3 of these, otherwise known as dwarf sag, and start splitting them up into the individual plants this time, because there's actually a lot of different individual plants in this little cluster. There's a few yellow leaves I can see there as well, which I'm going to pull off. Any of the bigger older leaves as well I'm going to pull off just to try and stimulate new growth. But yeah, just starting on this dwarf sag. So next I'm going to split up the Starigine repens. I'm assuming this is similar to Ludwigia repens, even though I've never had this. Maybe in the same family, I don't know, I'll have to look it up, but it certainly looks quite similar, like a little bushy plant, bushy stem plant. And these types of plants, you can basically snap up the stems, and each part of the stem, provided it's got at least one root of its own, will turn into a new plant. But you can see already there's just a plant here on the side, which I can tease off a little bit. Just being very careful not to damage the roots too much. As long as it's got some roots, it should take. There we go, that's a little plant. We've got lots of dwarf sags here, and I've actually binned some of the smaller ones just because it's going to be too fiddly to plant them. But you've got what is the main plant in each pot. You can see this was the main one that was growing, and all these are just little offshoots that it's kind of sent off. But you can see they've all got their own good root structure, so hopefully these should take quite well. A lot of Java fern. I think I've gone a bit overkill on plants here, especially when they get settled in the aquarium and start growing quite vigorously. I think I have to trim them back quite a lot. But just teasing this Starigine repens open here. Good root structure. Now you can see it all. And it's actually multiple plants, it's different stems. You can actually just, there I've just picked one stem off, didn't even need to pull it really, and there's its own root structure. And that's all I'm doing, is just pulling each stem, and it just comes away very easily. So you shouldn't have to pull too hard, just almost tease it out with the stone wool there. There's a good stem. So this root structure has got two stems coming from it, and you can see these tiny little nodes with a root coming from it. If you chop that top bit off with a root, that'll turn into a brand new plant. So I'm just repeating just the same process over and over to split up all the Starigine. So they've been sat out of the water for some time now, all the plants really, so I'm just going to give them a little spray. Not too bothered about my floor getting wet, it's just a wooden floor, so I can always wipe it up afterwards. But you don't want these drying out for too long. They'll be in the tank in about half an hour anyways, so just to keep them going until I get them in the tank. Use as much water as you want. But these shouldn't be as vulnerable as plants that were grown in water their whole lives. Because these are grown in these pots in air, it's just very humid air, they should be a little more resistant to drying out than plants that are just grown in the water. So that should be enough for now. So next we're going to move on to another easy looking one to separate, Lobelia cardinalis. And this is another background plant. Very nice looking plant, this Lobelia. Got some purple undersides to the leaves that look quite good under the bright light. And once again, just popping it out of the pot, very easy. Find the split in the stone wall, which is just here, and very gently tease it apart. So there we go, I've got two plants already. You can see the individual stems, the root structures on each, and there's a brand new plant. I'm just going to repeat the same. Okay, so that's the Lobelia all separated now. Got quite a few plants out of that, and it just looks really healthy. Nice purple looking colour on it. So that's going to be really interesting when it grows into a big bushy plant. Just a side note as well, I'm going to try and keep all the plants together in the tank, or at least in little clusters. I wouldn't just plant one on its own. I think it just looks a bit unnatural. So with the Starigine repens, I'd plant say minimum 5 stems in the bunch, just to create a more bushy looking plant, as opposed to just one stem. Same with the sags as well. I'm really going to group this together to make like a carpet look. I'm not going to plant it really close together at the outset. I'm going to plant them say ½ an inch apart, so that they can grow together and make that carpet over time. So next I'm moving on to Limophilia sessiflora, and I'm probably butchering that name. I'll put it on screen for you now and the common name as well. But this is another bushy stem plant, but I just really like the look of it. It's got tiny little leaves on it. Almost looks like a little tree. But the interesting thing about this is it doesn't come in a pot with stone wool. It just looks like it's a clump of roots here. So this looks like it should be easy to separate. But yeah, it's another plant that looks like Starigania repens or Ludwigia repens, where you can just tear a bit off with a root on and it should grow. Let's have a look, see what this looks like. So there you go, it's in a sort of massive roots at the bottom. And if I just tease this out, there we go, it opens out into the different plants. So I think I'm just going to pull off each stem at a time. I don't see any roots growing up the individual stems really, so you can't, I don't think, oh, there's a fly just flew off right up my nose. I don't really see many roots growing off a stem itself, so I wouldn't just tear a bit off this and hope it would grow. I'd always start at the bottom and try and get a root structure with it. I'm just going to tease off the first one. Not a lot of roots on this. That's all the roots you get, just a few. But there, that's one plant. But yeah, again, I'll be planting this in groups of 3 or 4 just to make a more bushy plant. But I really like the look of the leaves. I'm just going to repeat the process. I think I prefer actually tearing it into larger plants, so I've got a few stems in one bunch here, and that'll be a lot easier to plant rather than these individual ones. So I think I've learned my lesson there. If you're doing this with any of these stringy plants, try and get a few together in one bunch and just plant that as a whole bunch. So that's that all separated, and the final couple of things I've only got Java moss to go, taxophyllum, 2 pots of that. I might do that at the very end. In fact, I might tie it to this rock now. That's what I'll do now. I'm going to avoid tying it to the wood, because when I start messing around with the wood, it detaches from the rock and it kind of rolls around. So I want to just try and wedge the Java fern on the wood and try not to tie any of it so I don't disturb it. But with the moss, I think I'll tie the majority to this little rock here. So I'm actually going to start splitting up the moss now. Just in this weird gel, this weird mineral gel. The easiest way to take this off is just to give it a rinse in water. And just prise it off the back of the moss. Give the moss a good rinse. Get all the gel off. Then we'll go as a squeeze some of the water out. Moss is quite tough, it should be able to take a bit of a squeeze. And there's a good sized clump of moss. So with this, I might just leave it as a large clump in fact, and just tie it straight to the rock as it is. So with longer rocks like this, I'm just going to tear out the moss very carefully down the middle as best I can. It's just a tangled massive kind of holds and whatnot, root structures. I'm just going to tie it on in a way I think looks quite nice. So just down the top of the rock there. When I place the rock in the tank, hopefully it should spread out the rock over the coming months. Things like cherry shrimp, which I'm hoping to get, will really enjoy grazing on this as well. It's really good for them, and any baby fish that come along, if I end up getting live bearers, can hide in this. Provides a bit of protection for them. So moss is really one of the best things you can get for your fish tank. It pulls some of the nutrients out of the water column and prevents algae. So even though I'm using thread here, you can use fishing line if you want it to last for longer. You can use rubber bands, cable ties, or you can actually get like plastic mesh online, which is safe for the fish. So it's a green flexible plastic mesh that you just put over the moss, and the moss finds it very easy to grow through. I've had that before, and I used it with Rucha fluitans, and that was actually really good. So I'd recommend, instead of using this thread, it's just what I had available, just get some planting mesh, like moss mesh or whatever it's called, off Amazon. It looks a bit messy, this moss, when you first tie it on, but in a couple of weeks it all starts to grow through whatever you've tied it on with, and it turns into like a nice grassy effect. But as I say, shrimp and catfish and whatnot love digging through this looking for little morsels of food. So this long narrow rock was actually quite easy to tie to, and dragonstone in general is easy to tie to just because it's so angular. The rocks you're going to struggle with is like smooth cobbles and things like beach pebbles. But yeah, I'm happy with that, so I'm going to tie it off. And the only plant I've got left is this Salvinia, and this is just a floating plant, so I'm going to wait until the tank's actually set up, take this out, and then just scatter some on the surface. But it's looking good, and I think I'm going to call it a day there. So that's all the plants separated, ready to go in the tank now. I'm just going to keep them wet, keep them hydrated, and I'm going to set up the tank straight away now. So I'm going to do my time-lapse video, and I'm basically just going to move all these slightly over to the side, have them all ready to go, so when I need them I can just pick each plant one by one and plant it in the substrate. For the substrate, I've got the fluval stratum. I've washed all of this, it's been in a separate bag, it's been saved, and I've just put it back in the original bag just to make it easier to put in the aquarium, and it's still damp, so that's what you want it like when you plant, and you want it slightly damp. If yours isn't damp when you're about to plant it, just use your little spray bottles just to dampen the Aqua Soil or whatever you're planting into. And yeah, so stay with me for next episode. I'm not going to have any talking in the next episode, it's just going to be a kind of arty video. We're going to have some nice music on, and basically yeah, just enjoy the aquascaping next video. Just a last minute mention, I've actually retied all the wood onto the rock because I went to tie on the Java fern and it just basically all fell to bits. So I definitely recommend, if you're going to try something like this, is just silicone it to the rock first, then leave it a couple of days to set. But I just really want to get the tank set up. Lockdown's coming and I've only got a limited number of days when I can get the fish, so I kind of just want it all set up. But I think actually this looks a lot better. I've made it more of like a root cluster, as if it's just an old fallen tree. I'm going to have this off to the left hand side in the tank and have all these spindly branches with Java fern on the right hand side. This is a preview clip of 2 videos time, and I basically wear my GoPro to give you a point of view, viewpoint of me setting up the new tank. So you'll follow every step along the way. I'll discuss every step and why I'm doing it, so you can follow along, say if you're setting up your own fish tank, and it should prove to be quite helpful hopefully. So I'll be putting the plants in, all the hardscape, everything up to filling up the tank in that video. But next video, as mentioned, I'm going to have a time lapse of setting up the fish tank, and there's not going to be any talking in that, it's just going to be a cinematic video with some nice music on. But don't worry if you do want an explanation of anything I'm doing in that video, because the one following on from that will just be a voiceover like this one, explaining everything. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching this video if you made it this far. Please leave a comment if you enjoyed it, please like the video, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're not getting notifications from me, just click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button. But once again, thank you so much for watching.